He knew what I had for dinner. I never told him, and by the time I found the cameras hidden in every room, he was already at the front door, trying to get in. This happened a couple of years ago during my first and only experience with a vacation rental app. I'd booked a small place for 3 nights, a cozy-looking spot tucked into a wooded neighborhood where the houses were spread apart with plenty of trees and land between them. It looked peaceful online, private. Exactly what I wanted for a few days away from everything. When I arrived around 5 in the evening, reality didn't quite match the listing. The rental was small, which I expected. What I didn't expect was the main house sitting literally 10 feet away from it. The rental was clearly a converted secondary structure on the same property. Same driveway, same yard, practically sharing a wall with whoever lived next door. So much for privacy. I parked near the rental and started hauling my bags inside. That's when the front door of the main house opened and a man walked out, heading straight for me. He introduced himself as Gerald, the property host. He was in his mid-50s, tall, heavy-set, with a thick gray beard and deep-set eyes that seemed to study me a little too carefully. He smiled a lot, but the smile never quite reached those eyes, and he kept calling me buddy. Not in a friendly way, more like he was trying too hard to seem harmless. He didn't say anything alarming. Asked about my drive, pointed out where things were, told me to let him know if I needed anything. Standard host stuff, I guess. But something about him sat wrong in my gut from the very first handshake. Just this low hum of unease that I couldn't rationalize away. After a few minutes, he headed back to his house, and I hoped that would be the last real interaction of my stay. I unpacked, settled onto the couch, and decompressed for a while. Later that evening, around 8:30, I decided to cook the ribeye steak I'd grabbed from a grocery store on the way in. I'd had this idea of making a nice first-night dinner, but exhaustion had caught up with me, so I just threw it in a pan, seared it fast, and ate it plain. No sides, no presentation. Just hot food and silence. Afterward, I showered and went to bed, falling asleep almost instantly. The next morning, I woke up feeling decent, made some coffee, scrolled through my phone, and decided to head into town early to pick up groceries for the next couple of days so I could spend the rest of my time relaxing without errands hanging over me. The trip took about an hour, quick and uneventful, but the moment I pulled back into the driveway, Gerald appeared. He stepped out of his house like he'd been waiting by the window, watching for my car. He waved casually as I parked. I nodded back, hoping that was the end of it, and started pulling grocery bags from the trunk. When I turned around, he was standing right behind me, close enough that I almost bumped into him. "How was your first night, buddy? Everything go smooth?" "Yeah," I said quickly. "Everything was great." He smiled that same unsettling smile. "How'd the steak turn out? Hope the kitchen had everything you needed." I felt the words hit me like cold water. How did he know about the steak? I know my face gave me away. I stammered for a second before he jumped back in casually. "The steak. You mentioned yesterday you'd picked one up for dinner, remember?" "Oh, yeah, right. It was good, thanks." He nodded, smiled again, and walked back to his house without another word. I stood there in the driveway, grocery bags in hand, replaying our entire conversation from the day before. Had I mentioned the steak? I couldn't remember doing that. Our interaction had been brief, maybe 3 minutes, and I'd spent most of it feeling uneasy, not making small talk about my dinner plans. It seemed incredibly unlikely that I'd casually volunteered what I was cooking that night, but I had no proof otherwise. Maybe I did say it and forgot. Maybe hosts just make conversation and I was being paranoid because the guy gave me a weird vibe. This was my first time renting like this. I had no frame of reference for what was normal. I spent the next few hours glancing out the windows, half expecting to see Gerald lingering in the yard. I never did. His house was quiet. That gave me a sliver of comfort, and I managed to enjoy the rest of the day. Made a simple dinner, watched some TV, eventually went to bed. Sometime deep in the night, I woke up. No sound triggered it, no nightmare. Just a sudden, full-body awareness that something wasn't right. The kind of feeling where your eyes are open and your brain is screaming before you've even formed a conscious thought. I sat up in bed and waited. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. But the feeling wouldn't leave. This heavy, pressing sensation like unseen eyes were locked onto me. I got up and walked slowly through the dark house, checking each room. Kitchen, empty. Bathroom, empty. Living room, empty. Then I reached the front door. It was unlocked. I opened it carefully and looked outside. The yard was still. Gerald's house was dark except for one light glowing deep inside, like a single room illuminated while the rest of the house slept. I closed the door and locked it. At the time, I convinced myself I'd simply forgotten to lock up before bed. I was tired. It happens. I checked the rest of the house to make sure I was alone, found nothing, and went back to sleep. I woke again at 5 in the morning, well before sunrise, and this time, my brain was fully online. Everything from the past 2 days started connecting. The steak comment, the way Gerald seemed to appear the moment I arrived home, the unlocked door in the middle of the night, the constant feeling of being observed. I got dressed and started searching the house with intention. Every corner, every shelf, every outlet. And within minutes, I found it. In the kitchen, one of the wall outlets had a black charging brick plugged into it. A USB cable dangled from it, made it look completely normal, like a complimentary phone charger left for guests. But when I leaned in close, I saw it. A tiny dark circle on the front face of the adapter. A lens, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. My blood went cold. I ripped it from the wall and started tearing through the house. The living room had one. The hallway had one. The bedroom, where I'd slept, where I'd changed clothes, where I'd been completely vulnerable for 2 nights, had one plugged in right next to the nightstand. Every single room, every single angle. He'd been watching everything. I was mid-panic when I heard it, heavy knocking at the front door. "Hey, buddy, you mind opening up for a second? Just need to check a couple things real quick." Gerald's voice was calm but urgent. The knocking came faster. "Hey, I know you're in there. Open the door." He wasn't asking anymore. The friendliness was gone. His voice had that sharp edge of someone who knows they've been caught and is trying to control the situation before it spirals. I didn't answer. I grabbed my bag and started throwing everything into my suitcase as fast as I could. His knocking continued, harder, louder, more desperate. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the pounding. I froze and listened, and then I heard the unmistakable sound of a key sliding into the front door lock. The deadbolt clicked open. The handle turned. I slammed the bedroom door shut, shoved my suitcase through the window, and climbed out after it. My feet hit the ground just as I heard the bedroom door swing open behind me. I didn't look back. I sprinted to my car, threw myself inside, and tore down the driveway so fast the tires screamed against the gravel. I drove an hour to the nearest hotel and spent the rest of the day on the phone with friends, family, and eventually the police. Officers went to Gerald's property to investigate. He let them look around willingly, because by then, every single camera was gone, removed, scrubbed clean. He denied everything, said I was confused, said nothing I described had happened, my word against his, case closed. But here's what confirmed everything for me. Within days of my report, Gerald's rental listing vanished from the platform, completely deleted, no trace of it. And years later, I've checked, it's never come back. He didn't take it down because business was slow. He took it down because he knew what he'd been doing, and he knew that the next person who found those cameras might not make it out through the bedroom window in time. He was standing in my headlights in the middle of the trail, eyes wide open and bloodshot, a crowbar gripped in his hand, and the only reason I'm alive is because I didn't hesitate for a single second. A couple of years ago, I drove up to a remote cabin rental in northern Minnesota for a few days alone. I'd done this kind of trip before. Privately owned cabins, basic websites, no frills. The kind of place that doesn't show up on the big rental platforms. Just a landowner with a spare property and a barely functional webpage with some photos and a booking form. Sketchy looking by modern standards, but that's pretty standard for remote cabin rentals. I'd stayed at places like this before without any issues. I picked this particular spot because it was cheap and the surrounding woods looked beautiful in the pictures. Dense, quiet forest. Exactly the kind of place you go when you want to completely disconnect from the city and just breathe for a few days. But from the moment I stepped out of my car and looked at those trees, something felt wrong. I don't know how else to describe it except to say that the woods didn't feel empty. They looked still. No movement, no sound. But my gut was sending signals my brain hadn't caught up to yet. Standing at the edge of that tree line felt like standing at the edge of something watching you back. I told myself I was tired from the drive and being in my own head too much. I went inside, got a fire going in the fireplace, and spent the rest of the evening trying to decompress. Eventually, I got tired enough to sleep. Somewhere around 1 or 2 in the morning, something woke me up. A sound on the front porch, soft at first, like something shifting its weight on old wooden boards, slow and deliberate. By the time I was fully awake and alert, the sound was already fading, moving away from the door and into the dark. I got up and opened the front door quickly, scanning the porch and the yard beyond it. Nothing. No animal, no figure, no movement anywhere. Just the trees standing black against the night sky, and that oppressive silence pressing in from every direction. I stood there longer than I should have, staring into the dark between the trees. Then I closed the door, locked it, and went back to bed. It took a long time to fall asleep again. Morning came calm and ordinary. Coffee, a simple breakfast, nothing unusual. By midday, the sunlight through the cabin windows made the whole experience feel like an overreaction. I decided a walk through the woods would reset my head and shake off the residual unease. I figured fresh air and daylight were exactly what I needed. There were no marked trails leading away from the cabin, so I just walked in a straight line behind it, pushing through the undergrowth. After about 5 minutes, I came across a path. Narrow, barely visible. Just a faint worn strip between the trees where the ground had been compressed over time by repeated footsteps. It could have been wildlife, could have been hikers. I followed it anyway. The path wound maybe a few 100 feet deeper into the forest before ending at a campsite. A large tent had been set up. One of those heavy-duty, semi-permanent structures with real stakes and a full rainfly, not the kind you pack up after a weekend. Around it, scattered across the ground, was a collection of old gear, tools, containers, and debris that had clearly accumulated over a long period of time. This wasn't a weekend camper. Someone was living out here. The tent flap was open, no one inside, but the site was clearly active, recently used, actively maintained. Whoever it belonged to had been there not long before I arrived. I thought about how far the campsite was from the cabin I was sleeping in. Maybe a 4-minute walk through the trees. That's it. I turned around and went straight back. Once inside, I tried to contact the cabin owner. That's when I realized the website had only listed an email address. No phone number. My phone had barely 1 bar of service out there, making anything data-related nearly impossible. I sent an email and got nothing back. I was effectively cut off from any way to get real answers. The rest of that afternoon, the woods stayed quiet. I kept watching the tree line through the windows, half expecting to see movement. There wasn't any. As the sun started dropping behind the trees, I cracked open a beer and tried to convince myself I was being irrational. Someone camping nearby wasn't a crime. Remote areas attract off-grid types. It didn't have to mean anything threatening. 20 minutes after dark, I got my answer. A sound at the front door stopped me cold. Not knocking, not a voice. A scratching. Loud, rhythmic, deliberate, dragging across the wood surface of the door over and over, like something with a sharp edge being worked along the frame. I set down my drink and walked slowly toward it, every step tightening the knot in my stomach. When I was standing just inches from the other side, I could hear something else underneath the scratching, heavy breathing. "Hey," I shouted. "Who's out there? What the hell are you doing?" The scratching stopped instantly. Scrambling footsteps rushed away from the porch and disappeared into the darkness. I yanked the door open, probably not my smartest moment, and caught a glimpse of a man disappearing into the tree line, running hard, not looking back. I looked at the door. Along the frame, fresh gouges and scrape marks had been cut into the wood. He'd been using something to try and pry it open. He hadn't been scratching randomly. He'd been trying to get inside. The realization hit me with a physical weight. I was completely alone out here. There was no neighbor within shouting distance. No one who could hear me if something happened. No one who would even notice until I didn't come home. Whatever this man wanted, and the campsite hidden minutes away from my door made his intentions feel very deliberate. I was entirely on my own. I didn't think about it any further than that. I moved fast, grabbing only what mattered: wallet, keys, phone, bag, and walked out to my car. The night outside was absolutely silent. Not peaceful silent, wrong silent. The kind of quiet where the normal sounds of the forest have been replaced by something held, like the woods were waiting. I got in, started the engine, and began driving down the dirt trail that led back through the trees toward the main road. The headlights cut a narrow tunnel of light through the dense forest on either side. I gripped the wheel and kept my eyes forward. He came out of nowhere. 1 second, the trail was empty. The next, a man was standing directly in front of my car, frozen in the headlights. I hit the brakes hard. The tires locked up on the dirt, and the car stopped just feet from him. He looked the way someone looks when they've been living outside for a long time and not by choice. Wild, weathered, completely unraveling. His eyes were wide open and bloodshot, staring straight into my windshield with an expression I couldn't read as anything rational. His hair and clothes were tangled and dirty, and in his right hand, held loosely at his side, was a crowbar. For 1 frozen second, we just stared at each other. Then he started moving around the front of the car toward the driver's side window. The moment he stepped out of my direct path, I floored the accelerator. The car lurched forward, and I felt a heavy thud against the rear panel as I blew past him, his crowbar connecting with the side of my car as I accelerated into the dark. I didn't brake. I didn't look in the mirror. I drove until the trees broke open and the paved main road appeared ahead of me, and then I kept driving for another 2 hours before I stopped. I spent the following days trying to reach the cabin owner through every avenue I could find. Email, the website contact form, looking up the property records. Nothing. No response, no real information. The whole operation had the feeling of something that didn't want to be found. I'll never know who that man was or how long he'd been living in those woods. I'll never know if he'd done this before to other guests at that cabin, or if the owner even knew he was out there. But I think about the scratching on that door and realize, if I hadn't yelled, he might have gotten it open, and nobody out there would have heard a thing. I heard him come down the stairs, slow, deliberate footsteps moving through the house in complete darkness, and when he walked into the living room and whispered, "Where the hell are you?" under his breath. I was standing 5 feet away, frozen in the corner, praying he wouldn't take one more step forward. This happened a few years ago when I was in between apartments. I'd just moved out of my old place but hadn't found anything new yet, so I put all my belongings in a storage unit and booked a short-term rental for a few weeks to buy myself time. The listing I found was in a quiet neighborhood about 30 minutes from where I used to live. Small town, not particularly nice but not terrible either. Just somewhere cheap and functional while I sorted my life out. The house itself was older, a little worn down, but clean enough. Single story, basic layout, nothing fancy. I didn't need fancy. I just needed a roof and a bed while I apartment hunted. On one of my first nights there, I happened to glance out the front window and saw 2 men standing on the sidewalk outside. They weren't just passing by, they were stopped, facing the house, clearly looking up at it. The moment they noticed me in the window, they looked away quickly and walked off in opposite directions. It felt deliberate, rehearsed even, but I told myself it was probably nothing. Neighbors curious about who was renting the place, maybe. I closed the blinds and went back to what I was doing. The next afternoon, I went out to my car to grab a few things I'd left in the back seat. As I was walking back toward the house, I noticed a man standing down the street, just one house over, near the curb. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there. When our eyes met, he didn't look away. He stared at me. Not a casual glance, a full, unblinking stare like he recognized me or was trying to memorize my face. It made my skin crawl. I broke eye contact first and went inside. I wondered if he'd been one of the men from the night before, but it had been too dark to get a good look at their faces. I had no way to know, and honestly, what would that even mean if he was? I convinced myself I was overthinking it and got back to work. I spent most of that day on my laptop in the upstairs bedroom, catching up on freelance projects and scrolling through apartment listings for hours. Around 8 that evening, I came downstairs and made a quick dinner. At 9, just before bed, I tied up the kitchen trash and took it out to the bins on the side of the house. That's when I noticed the stone pathway leading to the backyard. I'd been so busy the past few days that I hadn't even thought to check out the back of the property. The path reminded me, so I followed it through a narrow gate in the fence. The backyard was small and enclosed by an old wooden privacy fence that looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. From inside the house, I'd assumed there was nothing back there except maybe some grass and a fire pit. But tucked into the far corner, partially hidden by overgrown weeds, was a shed. a big one, built from the same weathered wood as the fence, with double doors held shut by a rusty latch, and through the gaps in the planks I could see light. I walked over slowly, listening for any sound coming from inside. Nothing. No voices, no movement, just the faint glow of a bulb bleeding through the cracks. I unlatched the doors and pulled them open. The shed was empty of people, but it wasn't empty. Inside was an old couch pushed up against one wall, a couple of mismatched desks, a wooden dresser with the drawers hanging open, and a single overhead bulb switched on, casting dim yellow light across everything. It didn't look like storage. It looked like someone had been living in there, or at least spending a lot of time there. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, staring at that couch, at the furniture arranged like a makeshift living space. My gut told me something was very wrong, but my brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe the previous tenant left the light on weeks ago and nobody noticed. Maybe the owner used this as overflow storage and forgot to turn it off. I reached up, clicked off the light, closed the doors, and walked back inside. I tried to shake the unease by watching TV on the living room couch. It was one of those old recliners that pulled out into a near-flat position, and after about 30 minutes of zoning out in front of the screen, I fell asleep right there. I woke up hours later to the sound of a door closing, not outside, inside the house. My eyes snapped open. I stayed perfectly still, listening. Footsteps, slow and deliberate. Someone was moving through the house in the dark. I heard them cross the entryway, then climb the stairs, each step creaking under their weight. They went upstairs. I heard them walk into the bedroom I'd been using earlier. A pause. Then the footsteps came back down. This time they moved toward the back of the house, into the hallway, toward the living room. I slid off the couch as quietly as I could and pressed myself into the corner of the room, the darkest corner where the light from the windows didn't reach. My heart was pounding so hard I thought he'd hear it. A figure stepped into the doorway. Silhouetted against the faint glow from the streetlight outside, I could see the outline of a man. Average height, broad shoulders. He stood there for a moment, completely still, scanning the room. His head turned slowly toward the couch, the empty couch where I should have been sleeping. And then he whispered, "Where the hell?" It was quiet, frustrated, like he was talking to himself, like he'd expected to find me there and couldn't understand why I wasn't. I stopped breathing. I didn't move a muscle. I was maybe 5 feet away from him, hidden in the shadows, and if he took even 2 steps further into the room, he'd see me. But he didn't. He stood there a moment longer, staring at the couch, then turned and walked back down the hallway. I heard the back door open. A few seconds later, it closed. Then silence. I waited. 10 seconds. 20. My legs were shaking so badly I could barely stand. When I was sure he was gone, I grabbed my phone and keys off the coffee table and ran for the front door. I didn't look back. I got in my car, locked the doors, and called 911. While I waited for the police, I tried calling the Airbnb host. No answer. I tried again. Nothing. The cops arrived within 15 minutes, and less than 5 minutes after they did, the host showed up. I hadn't been able to reach him all night, but suddenly he was there, pulling up in his truck, acting calm and cooperative, like this was all some misunderstanding. The officers searched the property with flashlights. They checked the house, the shed, the perimeter, found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no evidence anyone had been inside. They took my statement, told me they'd file a report, and that was it. The host gave me a full refund on the spot. I packed my things that same night and left. Here's what I know. The man who came into that house knew the layout. He went straight upstairs to the bedroom, the one I'd been using all week. He knew where I was supposed to be, and when he didn't find me there, he came back down to search the rest of the house. He wasn't surprised the door was unlocked. He wasn't looking around like a stranger. He moved like someone who'd been there before. I'm convinced it was the host, and I'm convinced he had a key, and I'm convinced that if I'd been asleep in that upstairs bedroom when he came in, I wouldn't have woken up in time, because he wasn't there to talk. He wasn't there to check on the property. He was there for me. And the only reason I'm still here is because I fell asleep on the wrong couch.